Hello, good morning everyone. My name is Vera Blau McCandliss. I'm the VP of Education and Research at Panda, so essentially I'm responsible for a lot of the content we create. And it so happens that my background is also in academia, so I actually studied reading and dyslexia sort of in my previous life before I came to industry. So you might find some of the core concepts and topics that Dr. Singh talked about come back in this talk. I'll stay a little bit more high level and sort of I'm trying to divide the talk into two halves. One where I talk about the science and why reading really is quite a profound challenge for the human brain as we go from this transition from pre-reader to becoming a fluent reader. And I think a lot of times we just kind of assume that kids should just learn how to read, but we don't really have a good understanding of how difficult of a task it is and how big of an accomplishment it is for each individual child. So I think understanding that really helps us think about, the important task of our educators and what's really happening and what you are doing on an everyday basis, which I think is amazing. The second part of the talk, I want to relate or tell you a little bit more about our curriculum at Panda, and even though I probably don't have time to go into details, just outline some of the design principles that we've derived from some of the research. And then I hope later on you come approach me with lots of questions. Okay, so to start out with, I just want to draw your attention to something that probably most of you already know, but the fact that illiteracy still is a big global issue. And this is data from, I think, the UNESCO from 2012, saying that there's still about 250 million kids, school-age children in the world, that haven't learned how to read or write. And of that 250 million, it's actually about 120 million that never make it to grade 4. And what this means is, it's pretty clear, it prevents all these children from really maximizing their potential economically, professionally, and really making a big impact. So you might think, okay, this is a big number, right? Maybe a lot of it is caused by some of the countries where the kids just don't have access to good education, and that's certainly the case. But I do want to also draw your attention to the U.S. Even in the U.S., where we're from, our sort of yearly assessments that we do, we find that it is no less than 66% of our kids in third grade that are actually reading below grade level. So they're below the benchmarks where they should be, and they're essentially not reading proficiently, according to our own benchmarks. And this is quite a tragedy, because we know that the ability of these kids to finish their education successfully is highly predicted by their ability to read proficiently by third grade. So if we don't achieve reading by third grade, it is very, very difficult to catch these kids up. So we really have this window of opportunity very early on. And this is starting at the preschool age, where we can really either determine, we sort of make a big impact on how successful these children are going to be in the future. So whether globally or nationally, becoming literate really seems to have a high risk of failure. It's a difficult task. So the question here I want to ask first is, why is learning to read such a challenge? And similar to Dr. Singh, I kind of had to smile a little bit seeing some of your slides, because I'm gonna come back to some of these same concepts of neuroplasticity, of connecting different brain regions, of rewiring the brain for reading. Okay, so again, the brain. Why is it so difficult? Well, first of all, the brain is not really wired to learn how to read. It's an acquired skill. We need many years of practice and to acquire it. And simply, one of the reasons is that writing systems are really not all that old from an evolutionary perspective, right? So it's only about maybe 5,000 years ago that we had the first writing system. From an evolutionary perspective, that's very recent, and there's no sort of reason for our brains and our neural circuits to have adapted to the task of reading. Given that this is the case, what does it look like for an individual child? How do they go through the process of learning to read? And again, we heard earlier that the first step is really not reading, obviously. Every child learns to speak before they learn how to read, at least, when you grow up in the United States and this is your mother tongue, that's what's happening, right? And we also heard that that's very important because we need to build up these representations of the language, these phonological representations, and those will actually then help us fine-tune and specialize our brain to actually decode the words when we learn how to read. So the interesting thing here is, to me, always has been that when we learn a language, the main unit, functional unit of organization, what's relevant for you, is really the word. Sometimes a little bit maybe of the syllables initially if we do some babbling when we're very little, but in the end it's the word that communicates meaning. That's our vehicle for, communicating what we need to do, right? However, once we start formal schooling, all of a sudden we're being told that now we need to use these little symbolic representations that are individual letters. And all of a sudden those are the relevant unit for communicating. And it's very confusing because there's no easy way for us to yet access the speech sounds which kind of map onto those letters. So one of the big tasks is for reading development and transitioning from being a pre-reader to a fluent reader is really reorganizing the brain to match the units of speech to the units of print. And we now luckily have a lot of techniques available that allow us not only to study this process as kids become literate from a cognitive and behavioral standpoint, but also to have us actually look inside the brain of kids. And I think we've just seen this in these very interesting studies that Dr. Zing presented with FMRI. And there's a few other techniques that we can use, such as this one, which is the EEG, where we can also measure some of the brain signals. So I want to now give you two examples that I think highlight very nicely of what really needs to happen in the brain for this transition to happen, for kids to really recognize and read language. So one of the very early things that need to happen, I want to just show you with this example. And it all goes around the question, how do we actually, when we think of reading, we think about it as a visual process, right? So there's something, we'll look at the page, there's a visual signal, it enters my eye, and then somehow magically I'm recognizing that word and its meaning. And it's actually been shown that process, which is rather complex, in an expert reader takes no more than about 250 milliseconds. 250 milliseconds is very quick. It's like me snapping once, it's about 250 milliseconds. So how is that possible? How is your brain so quick at doing something that is so new and not very natural for the brain? So to demonstrate this, I have this little image here of 3 different cups, and I want to ask you, is that the same cup? You can do this or that. Yes, of course it's the same cup, right? Makes total sense, it's an object. I just switched it on his head and I mirrored it, and of course it's the same cup. Now is this the same letter? No, and you're saying, no, of course not. And I'm like, well, why not? You just told me it's the same thing. I switched it upside down, I mirrored it, right? It's an image just like the other one. Now what you just told me basically is that your brain has been rewired to recognize that these different letters that are just been switched in orientation actually are distinct visual representation, have distinct meaning in your brain. And that is something that would not happen in a pre-reader. If I asked a pre-reader, is this the same letter? They would be like, yeah, probably. You just switched it around, right? And the fascinating thing to me is that this is a process that just going through schooling for a few years will fine-tune your brain to do this task and to actually override what you're, naturally prone to do, which is recognizing objects from different angles in different orientations and not making that discrimination. So again, I'm going to come back to this beautiful little area that has been identified called the visual word from area. And this area has been specialized, and it's so fascinating for me that it exists in the first place, actually, for the fast recognition of letters and words. And it kind of, the way that people think about it now, and nothing ever is certain, obviously, and in science as we constantly explore, but the way that people currently think about this area is that it might evolve as a result of us reusing some of the circuitry that we have in the visual areas for recognizing other types of objects. So faces, houses, etc. Our brain kind of knows how to do that because that's evolutionary, very adaptive, and that's something that kind of our brain is wired for. So it is likely that we kind of reusing some of these circuits that are already built in and doing their job to then allow the process of reading and visual word recognition to happen. And what's really interesting is that in some of these more recent studies where people have found that this area literally does not exist in pre-readers, but it really emerges over the course of literacy development. And therefore, we can call it a biomarker for dyslexia. So in other words, dyslexia also, but a biomarker for literacy. And so I think this is quite fascinating when you think about it. So if, for all the educators here in the room, I always like to point out that literally by teaching these kids what these letters are, by teaching kids how to recognize words, etc., you're literally helping these kids grow new functional regions in their brain. And this is something that happens over just a few years. And I think it's quite astonishing because there's not many skills that we learn with such intensity over such a short period of time. And most skilled and with the help of skilled educators will succeed at it. It's also not surprising then probably that you see this also being a biomarker, a potential biomarker of dyslexia. So when you scan kids, again, this is an FMRI study where we get more of the picture of the brain and where things are localized in the brain. What you see is that, and I'm going to try to use my cursor here, the middle picture, when you look, you hardly see any of the green show up here. And the green is sort of the activation pattern for the words, right? But if you look at the good readers, you see a nice big chunk of green showing up in this image. And so there's a big difference in how a struggling reader and a fluent reader really responds to these words in the first place. Now the big question then is, well, how does that happen? As we heard again, certainly language comes before reading. And initially, really the main task for a child is to relate what they see on the page and what they see in print to what they already know about the meaning of a word, given that they already speak the language. And so kind of the idea is that indeed we need to build this network of critical brain regions. We need to start connecting these regions in a functional way so that it can support the skill of learning to read. And one of the things that is critical here, and this is one of the earliest steps, and specifically relevant to alphabetic reading systems, is the integration of those minimal functional units, so that the individual letter and the individual sound, and bringing those together. And it's kind of an interesting process because likely it's certainly not one directional. It sort of involves all these brain regions and the communication between the temporal areas of the brain where phonology is coded and language is coded with sort of the back of the brain where a lot of the visual input happens and where ultimately word recognition happens, is something that really starts at this level of the letters and the sounds. And here, this is a study that I've done almost like more than 10 years ago now, I guess, where we looked specifically we scanned children in an MRI scanner, FMRI scanner, and we looked at how do they integrate individual letters with individual sounds. And we found that indeed there's an area that specializes in that, and that integration needs to be not only accurate, so on the behavior level, kids need not only to be accurate at letter sound integration, but they also need to be able to do it quickly. And so if you look at different languages, for example, dyslexia expresses itself differently depending on how closely the print and the language units are mapped to each other. So if it's a very inconsistent language, you might see a lot more accuracy deficits early on. But if I'm a very transparent language, so for example, Italian, you might see it expressed be more as a fluency deficit. So the kids, maybe they're relatively accurate, but they're still slower, and that's kind of what's tripping them up when they ultimately start decoding words, etc. Okay, so not surprisingly then, if we have something such as letter sound integration as being a core foundational skill for learning to read and being really sort of that connective tissue that allows us to then drive some of the fast specialization for letters and words in the visual cortex. It is not surprising then also that this might also be another biomarker for dyslexia, and I call it more of the proximate cause, simply because it is a little bit closer, one step closer to the actual print processing, but certainly there's, again, there's a network of brain regions involved, and any of those portions of that network of brain regions that need to form, that need to reorganize based on becoming literate, if any of those pieces are somehow misfunctioning, it's going to result in kids having trouble learning how to read. The other thing I want to point out here is that there's more and more studies of how we can potentially enhance and make that connection between the individual letters and the sounds more explicit. And I always think that's kind of funny that we pick this up as researchers, because when we look, it's something that educators actually have been doing for a long time, and sort of reporting on the efficacy of using multisensory, different types of presentations of the same material. It is something that's been proven effective, and many intervention programs for dyslexia will use similar strategies. They will have the kids tap the letters, they will have them write into sand, all kinds of different things, right? But now there's at least some research also on this topic, and I think it's really showing us that we can use input from various modalities, including touch, to really help kids integrate and learn about the connection between letters and sounds. And I would say this is particularly relevant for young children, and this is also particularly relevant for kids who either struggle with reading or, in some of the studies actually specifically also, kids who have come from low socioeconomic backgrounds and just didn't have enough opportunities to potentially fine-tune their phonological awareness system, their language system, to enable that integration. So it's kind of giving them a little extra help. It's giving them a little extra of the same information, but in a different format. So it makes it a little bit easier to access and potentially more memorable. Okay, so I hope by giving you a little bit of a sense of sort of the research and the science that we at least think about when we look at reading, when we look at designing curriculum, etc. And now I want to switch gears, and I want to talk a little bit more concretely about Square Panda and how we design our games, and at least at the high level what our principles are that we employ. So we talked a lot about how it is important to build that connection between the language areas and the print areas. And specifically, this means teaching phonics explicitly. But phonics is only going to be, of course, one of the various components to actually helping kids become fluent in reading. But we do know, and this is not just brain research, this is actually, there's a lot of great meta reviews on the educational side and from cognitive psychology that helped us understand that what's very important is that we teach in an explicit, systematic, and structured way. Meaning that there needs to be some kind of system, there needs to be scaffolded to allow kids to build on sort of the prior skills that they just acquired, and not just, throwing everything at them at the same time, basically. And the way we've taken this approach in Square Panda, and this is referencing our newest game, Squareland, is we have sort of decided, okay, for the first iteration of this game, what do we really want children to learn? And we decided that we really wanted them to understand the letters of the alphabet, the sounds that the letters make. So this is kind of what I call here Act 1, just to visualize this better. Then we wanted them to really understand that words can be broken up into individual units, and these units can be either larger or smaller units. So onset and rhymes would be an example of that. And then we wanted them to understand that they can now use these individual units and recombine them and build words with it. And then when we do this, when we think about a design sequence like that, we also kind of dig up different research studies and intervention studies and look at which of those have been proven to be highly effective in the research setting. And then we think about, is there anything we could do to adapt it to a game format so that we can, you know, have a game that potentially has a high likelihood of actually making an impact on a child's reading ability. So what also goes with that is that we do have a clear focus on phonics, and clearly our physical letters are a representation of that, but we also recognize that phonics is not everything, and we need to teach more than that. We need to teach kids, you know, how they combine the letters into words. You know, there's a lot of other things going on. There's syntax, there's semantics, etc. So we have come up with an early literacy scope and sequence that encompasses these different areas of spelling, vocabulary, comprehension, phonics, phonologic awareness, and print awareness. And we have sort of sequenced them for pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade levels. And what you see kind of color-coded here is just kind of representing which area the skill falls in. It's also showing you that with our new game release, what we're doing is we're kind of combining all those skills into one big game, and we're hoping to grow that over time. So, you know, that we can actually get a sense of where a child is on this map of all the skills that they ultimately need to have. And the color-coded ones that you see here are the ones that we initially cover, and then sort of our goal is to expand from there. Another principle that we are trying to take to heart and actually kind of working right now and expanding this area of language learning and phonological awareness is that we really believe it is important to put speech and language before print. So in other words, in the sequence of games, we ideally want to assess a child for how they're doing on some of the phonological awareness tasks, or are they even to the point where maybe they actually have an understanding of the individual sounds of the language. If they have the understanding of a couple, at least, individual sounds of the language, we feel a lot more comfortable leveling them up and actually showing them, you know, teaching them phonics, teaching what letters go with that sound. If they have very little understanding of that, we much rather keep them in the zone of language learning and actually sort of, you know, just keep the print for later. Because we want to make sure that they're ready whenever they're starting to learn, that they're actually ready to learn and are successful at reorganizing these brain circuits that I talked about earlier. So here are just two examples of this. If you check our product out there, there's one game, it's called Square Land, and it has some of these phonological awareness components in it. But again, we're currently working on expanding that a lot more. This is, by the way, also something that I think is a huge differentiator between a child growing up monolingually with English, because they're surrounded in this language environment for years and years, and obviously a second language speaker does not have that advantage. So it is quite a challenge to think about how do we enable these kids to catch up in a very short amount of time if we also want to make sure we teach them literacy and reading right away. So the third principle that I just want to point out here that we often talk about and use at Square Panda when we think about our games is that idea that we really want to make sure that kids connect the sublexical units with what we call the lexical units as soon as possible. And by that I mean that we do not wait until we have introduced the entire alphabet and all the sounds that all the letters make before we talk to kids about how letters are combined into words and that they actually have meaning. But what we do instead is we introduce letters in small sets. And then at the same time we assess kids on which letters they already know. And you could know as little as 4 letters, maybe 8 letters, and we would already tell you, oh, that's great, you know, I love that you know these letters. Let's look at what words you can build with those letters. And then let's look at what these words mean, right? And what we're doing then is we're building the understanding that there is really a goal to learning these letters and these sounds. And we're also reinforcing, actually, the learning of the individual letter, speech, sound connections in the context of a word. And that's also very, very important. Ultimately, and this is what this graph is supposed to show you, it's important for kids to map not only the letters to the sounds, but ultimately know at different levels of the hierarchy. So how do onset and rhymes, you know, printed correspond to onset and rhymes spoken? How do syllables printed correspond to syllables spoken? How do words printed correspond to words spoken? So there's different sort of units of analysis that we can that we can use, and we want to make sure that kids understand that there is a connection at all of these different levels of thinking about language and print, not just at the level of a letter and a sound. Next is our multisensory focus. We talked about that a little bit from the research perspective. It's pretty straightforward. I think when we give kids a tactile letter to touch and to explore at the same time as that they can see and hear the letter, we're just giving them another source of information about the identity of that letter. And we can potentially enhance the connection and the integration of the letters and the sounds by doing that. Now, once that integration is automated and they're all good to go, we probably don't really need those physical letters anymore. But in the beginning, it can be a very helpful tool and sort of a teaching aid for these kids. The last principle that I want to mention, and you're going to hear a lot more about this from a data perspective and from a learning perspective later, is the principle of adaptiveness. So I think we heard before that there's obviously big individual differences in how kids learn how to read. And we notice, obviously, from a lot of behavioral studies, but we also see it in the brain. And a lot of times, actually, I find this fascinating as well, that we can use certain tasks to actually predict whether kids are going to be good readers or poor readers. And we can often do that very early. And these individual differences just, especially if it's across different measures, it's quite predictive. So what this means is that we can also turn this around into a design principle, so to speak, and say, hey, we should make sure that each child learns at their own pace. We should make sure that each child gets exactly exposed to those skills and those materials that they struggle with most, but kind of trying to combine that with enough success experience that it's not frustrating. But certainly we want to give more support in the area that you struggle with more. And ideally, the support comes in the form of different games, different play patterns, different sort of sensory experiences, etc., etc. And so what you see here is basically just this idea that we have games, and each of these games, different colors, maybe there's a cluster of games on, say, phonics, and those would be all the yellow games. There's another cluster of games in phonological awareness, and maybe there's another cluster of games over here that is vocabulary related. Whatever it is, the idea is that ultimately we have this map of games sort of in our back-end system. And we can now see, depending on what the child already knows and doesn't know, we can now draw out a learning path for this child that is unique to the child, that might look very different for another child. And the key here is that we want to keep kids in this roughly zone of proximal development where, they get challenged a little bit, but they also still have enough success experiences. And it's both the intensity of the instruction, but also the exact content of the instruction that is relevant here. So this is us in a nutshell. I hope I was able to give you a little bit of a sense of both our theoretical foundations and what we like to think about, and then also what we do actually with our games and with our curriculum. And oftentimes, as you might imagine, what we learn from the sciences not always translates directly, and I certainly don't want to make it sound like that's the case. But it is an inspiration for us, and we like to stay up to date with the research and make sure that we incorporate whatever we know in terms of principles. And yeah, I hope you come check out the product, and please find me if you have specific questions about the curriculum.
I'm glad to learn more about the tactile integration with the auditory and the visual. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a bit more about how exactly that happens?
Yeah, so you mean the research back end, or yeah, okay. So it's mainly, I think, so the amount of studies on this are actually relatively limited, I would say. But there's some interesting work coming out of some of the French groups. So Vera and colleagues, and Fremdenbach is another one who has done it more globally. But especially the Vera studies I find kind of interesting. And basically what they've done is they tested kids on a couple of alphabetic knowledge, phonological awareness, and basic decoding measures, including non-word reading. And they have done two different training regimens. One would actually include a tactile component, and I think they actually used these foam letters that kids could touch. The other one didn't. So it's basically audio-visual, one condition, audio-visual tactile, the other condition. And what they found is that indeed, after training, a lot of the kids were doing better in the trimodal condition, so to speak, than they were in the bimodal conditions. And so that's kind of sort of the research side of things. And I'm hoping that there's more studies coming out on this. It's definitely something that we would love to do, to investigate ourselves. But again, I think there's also a whole bunch of evidence on the practical end. I mean, from coming straight from educators, right? And when we look at the intervention programs, when we look at the ideas of even Montessori, which is, now seems like a very old school concept, but there's the idea that for young kids, and specifically, we might really benefit from having tactile and being able to concretely relate what we're doing to sort of the world of touch. That's another sort of indication, at least, that there might be something to that. Yeah.
Seems to be very intuitive because sort of explains like they might have come about,
Yeah.
So essentially that.
It's yeah.
So
It's
it's
true.
very exciting that we can use that information which
It is. Yeah. There's also an interesting processing hypothesis on that. That is maybe a little too detailed, but yeah. Thank you.
Square, square, panda.